Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the last one. Just 15 more minutes to go. As Eyal said, my work concerns the context of violence a bit more, violence by soldiers. It's also based on anthropological work, I guess my contribution will look more at the axis of soldier versus civilian, occupied versus occupier, in a context of physical but also structural violence. And I think what I'm talking about today lies more in this last issue of structural violence. In many ways, the Palestinian civilian is the ultimate other, or the significant other even, for Israeli soldier working and serving in occupied Palestinian territories, or OPT, as I will say. Let me just put on the timer, now I'm forgetting. She's the one who will be stopped, checked, controlled, and as time arrested. She's the one who negotiates, pleas, begs, and sometimes curses the soldier. And this other represents, I think, among other things, a disorder for soldiers. She becomes the face of the hardship, the frustration, the anger, the boredom the soldiers associate with their work within a military occupation, and I've written about this elsewhere. And through processes of numbing soldiers go through, they experience uncertainty and moral blurring within their daily experiences of working in this context of the occupation. And so within this reality, the Palestinian is, I think, actively made into an other within the space of the checkpoint. So this is something I will look at. I will argue here that this othering by soldiers is done in an effort to regain a sense of order, of control, of normalcy even, within this blurred or numbed reality of their work. And more specifically, I will place this moral othering within the actual places where this meeting often involuntarily takes place between soldier and Palestinian civilian. And that is the military checkpoint, which I will argue is constructed by soldiers as a moral geography. It's a term by Matlis. And I will explore how moral boundaries, in a way, are drawn along physical borders in this landscape of conflict that we're talking about. So while not losing sight of also the symbolic meaning, of course, that borders have. So I will look at the way these Israeli soldiers craft the Palestinian into a moral other in order to create a sense of normalcy and order in the checkpoint. I guess we can say that the checkpoint, and I'm not sure if any one of you has time to travel a bit outside of this area of Israel. It's not so far away to travel to see the actual checkpoint that I'm talking about, and it serves for many people as a symbol of the meeting of the two, soldier and civilian. It's a site which, through its very planning and logic, actually enhances the processes of othering and maybe ordering, bordering, between brackets. And these checkpoints, which can be found all over the occupied Palestinian territories, have different shapes and sizes. You have really big ones like this one on the photo. That is Kalandia. I was there a few days ago. It still looks exactly the same. This is a bit of an older picture. It's a symbol for many Palestinians. It's a central symbol of the occupation. But for soldiers, it's also, and I quote Ben-Ari and others here, an unusual mix of power and vulnerability to potential attacks. So there's different meaning for both actors. In the OPT at large, so there are these permanent checkpoints. They've become large terminals that actually really resemble border crossings. There are smaller ones, flying ones, temporary ones, all kinds of different ways of meeting, actually, the other. So the logic behind the checkpoint from an official Israeli state point of view is one of security, obviously. They're needed to stop terrorists, stop forbidden good, weapons, explosives, etc., to reach proper Israel within the Green Line. But at the same time, checkpoints severely disturb Palestinian civilian life in the territories. Many checkpoints in the last years have been dismantled for these reasons, but they still are very central in the daily experience of Palestinians. When we go to this term of moral geography, Matlis defines, and I quote, as the conduct of particular groups or individuals in particular spaces may be judged appropriate or inappropriate, and the ways in which assumptions about this relationship between people and their environments may both reflect and produce moral judgment. So these judgments made by one group about another are closely linked to the idea of order, I will say. And in this case, it concerns the maintenance of order in an effort of selfing and of constructing a clear and normalized self within this context of the military occupation by the soldiers. So while constructing this clear other as inappropriate, the self becomes appropriately and firmly rooted within the moral boundaries of the own social group. This is my idea. The space within this moral othering takes place is this important, and order is maintained by controlling the flow of Palestinians and making clear who can go through and who can't through the checkpoints. And as I said before, we can use Van Houtem's and Naarsen concept of bordering, within brackets, where bordering is played out between immobilizing people and separating them from others. As the largest checkpoints communication, you saw that maybe in the last picture a bit more, it often happens through intercom systems, and ID papers are passed through a latch. There's a bulletproof window, and there's virtually no human contact anymore, especially in these big terminals. So these two groups of soldiers and civilians are actually physically separated. And I think also possible feelings of responsibility, general human empathy, etc., could also be diminished here. So the checkpoint is not only a physical obstruction; it's a site where the other is actively created within this specific space, using moral terms in this effort to create order. And important are the asymmetrical power relations between the two, of course, because the Palestinians are completely dependent on the soldiers who happen to be at the checkpoint at that time, and their papers and the regulations that are active at that point, while, of course, it's not the other way around. So the creation of order by soldiers and their need to establish this positive self-image within the context of their work within this military occupation is central to this othering. And in my research, I've often seen them depict Palestinians, for example, as poor, as dirty, backward, and I think this is a way to. This is where this need for order comes in. They come to portray this chaos around. As one commander put it, and this is also interesting, we want order at the checkpoint because order is professionalism, and this idea of professionalism also comes back a lot when you speak to soldiers, and especially to commanders as well. And in this following example of an interview, this soldier speaks about an imaginary line. So again, we see this idea of this need for order. So he says, for example, you say, don't cross that line. So if they would cross the line, I would get angry, and it would really bother me that they crossed it. In the beginning, yes, but as an experienced soldier, you want to get things going. Yalla, go. And he says, like, in the end, it didn't really bother me that they actually that they actually crossed it. But at the point, because they crossed it, he would get mad. So this Israeli soldier used the theme of order as something they need to bring into the chaos that the other in some way is producing. And in this discourse, you see that that Palestinians are seen often, and again, generalizing here, of course, but the idea they're living in poor and dirty and violent circumstances, and they become, and I think this is important, they become the embodiment of the cold, the heat, the dust, the boredom, and the hardship of the work of soldiers in the occupied territories. And I think this is also in the way that they become this chaotic entity that needs to be ordered. By clarifying who belongs to what moral categories, soldiers create this sense of knowing and understanding their reality. And you could say that they divide the world between like me or not like me, also in a hierarchical manner. You can even talk about, I think I skipped one, talk about inclusion or not in a moral community, talk about moral exclusion. In the paper this is based on, I talk a bit more about these ideas of who's included and how can people be excluded from our own moral community. At these, I think it's important to look at also a bit about the context where this categorization comes from. You know, these soldiers are not, exist not in a vacuum, but of course in a social, within a specific social context, which is, I can say a lot about it, but I'll just very quickly. There's first of all militarized society, and maybe you've seen it a bit around you, even if it's just like seeing a lot of military personnel around in the streets. But it is also goes into the education system, etc. So there's this specific mindset, but also I think there is this Orientalist, maybe you can call it, discourse in which the Arabs or the Palestinians are also outside of the military made into this other, the not to be trusted, the enemy, etc., etc. And now it's really the discourse is really on the terrorist, as if it's very clear who the terrorist is, and people in Europe should watch because it's coming to them. I mean, that's the new discourse I've been hearing a lot, not necessarily military. So a bit about the discourse then, how this actually looks like, this categorization, and that is that first of all, there are depicted as violent others. So often the violence of Palestinian villages as the violent others is very much emphasized. For example, this quote by a soldier: "So you meet people, Palestinians. Okay, I'm generalizing here, but the people you meet on the street aren't people who are interested to start a certain dialogue with you. You are seen as the monster, and they are different creatures." Or another, the place where I'm from and where he's from, there's a huge gap. Those people you arrest, all, and I'm generalizing, he says, but most have thrown stones or something. They've used violent resistance. How can I talk to a person who communicates by taking a rock and throwing it? His speech is in violence. Of course, then he reflects, of course, I'm the one who's walking around with a gun, but to hold it and to use it are two different things. So he's going on. I'm not walking around the city with it and killing people like they would do. I'm not just looking for a situation to load my gun and, just give me someone to kill. I wasn't raised like that. I was raised the complete opposite, very much making this distinction. And the last one says it very clearly. We are different. We are above them. We are not animals. We don't kill babies. A second feature that I found in this discourse that is constructing this other is the Palestinian as not trustworthy and to be pitied. Basically, you should pity them, we can trust them. An example of this is a quote about bribes. So this soldier says there's a thing of respect. If I took something from one of them, I have to give it back. We're not in that kind of relationship. In the end, they are beneath me. What can you do? It may be horrible, but it's reality. So to go quickly through the third feature, which is a bit, it sounds a bit contradictory, but I've heard a lot of soldiers also in the end talking about the Palestinian and actually explaining explicitly that the other is actually a human being. As in, I saw it as kind of reminding themselves that, hey, wait a minute, they're also a human being, and I think this is also, part of the same kind of story of categorization. In the end they are. And then the last feature, which I think is really important as well, and that comes back over and over, is talking about their own humanity, the own humanity of soldiers. When in this situation, I want to feel whatever happens. I want to still be a human being and see myself as a human being. And one little quote, just to finish with this, it was actually one of the best interviews I had. And this was a very sensitive young man, and he said to me, when I was sitting with the terrorist, he was sitting in the back, they just arrested someone, it was very important for me to have some kind of contact. Maybe naive, but I was determined to stay a human being and not becoming a machine of hate and fear. So really wanting to make this relationship with this person he calls a terrorist for his human dignity. It's just extremely interesting. So to conclude, I try to show how this construction works a bit very quickly through this sense of making the sense of order, making the sense of normalcy, regaining the same sense of normalcy in a situation of symbolic violence, in a situation of the occupation where the soldiers often feel they are doing really hard and grinding work, as they explain it, and making this order and making the other into a very clear other, moral other, more importantly, helps them, I think, in some way to make sense of their own situation. Thank you very much.
So we still have 11 minutes, which is probably enough for about 37 questions. So we'll take a few questions, and I've noticed a number of you have been looking at pieces of paper with a keyword, a cultural keyword here, meat. Okay? Well, so we'll break for lunch in a few minutes. All right, questions, please. Jack, please.
Well, I found all of these papers really fascinating, and they work really well. And so I'm going to just limit this to one question for Eugenio. I'm very interested in your project on contractors. A couple of questions is one, in terms of kind of this domestic opposition use of force cost. You might want to think about extending that to kind of international cost as well. I don't know if you've looked at, for example, Russia and their use of contract soldiers, kontraktniki in Chechnya, and some of the things they've been doing more recently in Crimea. And so it seems to me that the opposition may not be domestic in terms of their use of soldiers. It might be international. And so by employing contract soldiers, it gives them a way. The other thing is again, think about kind of NATO. For example, one of the big challenges in NATO has been this kind of question on burden sharing. So on the one hand, countries would want to have high soldier counts so that this would count well for them in terms of NATO. If you go to the placemat and you look at the contributions that way, etc. And so it might be interesting to look at how this kind of factors in some of these international concerns in terms of how that might impact their troop numbers.
We'll take 3 or 4 questions and then we'll get the answer. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Yes, I have one for Professor Heller. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering though, whether the way you present it is very much in a cause and effect way, but is it not so that those people serving in the battalion, second battalion you were addressing, that they might be a special kind of men and women, so that if you try to apply the same, so you have the power to apply the same changes in the Northern Battalion, you might not yield the same results.
Kobi, to Erella.
Yes, Erella. Could you elaborate about the context of the research? Because I have no clue what is the context of the research. Secondly, meaning what actually were the events during the research period of time, okay? Because it has an implication or two. Secondly, did you find in the research any gaps between the behavior of the soldiers in the checkpoint and the regulations, the formal or the official regulations of the IDF? So which kind of checkpoint? Is it an internal checkpoint in the territories themselves or between the territories and the State of Israel?
One more question? Yeah, in the back. The white shirt, yeah.
Erella Grassiani. What makes the checkpoints in Israel unique compared to other checkpoints in the world, like Ireland, Mexico, Colombia, Berlin? They've all used checkpoints. So if you look at like the IRA in Northern Ireland, what makes it special, what you're seeing here?
Okay, well, let's go for the answers. Eugenio, you want to?
All right, I will start very quickly. Thank you very much. There surely are international constraints or incentives, if you will, but when it comes to the international drivers of using contractors, I think that it could be more aptly be described as a form of plausible deniability, perhaps. It is a way to have a low footprint and deny state involvement in case anything goes wrong. And when it comes to NATO burden sharing, you're absolutely right. And indeed, what makes especially the study of contractor support to Operation ISAF fascinating is that some contractors were used by state MODs, but many were used by NATO as well, which outsourced as a way to bypass the hazards and frustrations arising from burden sharing among North Alliance participants. Thank you.
If I understood your question correctly, where are you? There you are. You were asking about if they're recruited is not
if it is self-selected, yes, right? Yeah.
Yes. Well, we've done some research on that, like Nina Rones back there, and we've done some research on that earlier to see how the soldiers are recruited, and especially for the officers' schools. There are some. Well, it's too too complicated, I think, to go into here. Just but as the conscript soldiers, they're recruited from the whole country, from all kind of different social class or whatever. So you would think that there would be a diversity. On the other hand, there are people interested in sports, maybe physical engagements. And they really want to do this maybe now because we have the cohort is about maybe 60,000 and we need just maybe 8,000 or 9,000 conscript soldiers. So there's about 50,000 of them not going into the army or the navy or the air force. I don't know if that answers your questions properly, but I would say that they are selected because of some interest, yes.
Yes, I'll do it quickly. A lot of questions. Thanks for your questions. Well, first of all, the research. This was part of my former research. So it's a bit older. It was I talked to soldiers who were conscript during the Second Intifada. So this was the. So I realized, of course, there have been changes, but I think the main issue of how the soldiers think about the Palestinians, I think they're still valid, and I most of all looked at. I didn't necessarily look at illegal practices myself. Of course, a lot of them told me about illegal practices or practices that were against regulations, but I think these, what I've been talking about now, these can be all within regulation. So it's very much a way of framing the other. But yes, for sure. I mean, soldiers have told me about gaps between the regulations and their behavior. But I think, of course, the regulations change all the time. So for soldiers, it was often also quite not always clear what could be done, and also depending on who was checkpoint commander, etc. Kinds of checkpoints. I've been to several checkpoints, but just to go around and see, and especially like Kalandia, which you can say, yeah, that is a border between. Somehow, I mean, the borders it's so complicated because it's to East Jerusalem. It's Kalandia is within East Jerusalem, going to East Jerusalem and beyond, but also on the other side, East Jerusalem. Is it Israel proper or not? Occupied territory? That's a long debate, and I don't think there's a very big difference in in the behavior. But a lot has changed, especially the privatization of the checkpoint, which is kind of is something that I'm dealing with more with now. So there's different personnel now in many of the bigger checkpoints going into Israel proper. But I'm sure we can talk about it later a bit more. Just about what is special about the checkpoints. I, of course, have not done research on other different checkpoints. I think what's very specific is that these are checkpoints, often checkpoints so within territory, not necessarily within the borders. There are no real official borders. So either if it's within Palestinian territory or to Israel territory, it's all quite a gray area. And I think the context of a military occupation is very important. And this is, I think, makes us quite different than a checkpoint, normal checkpoint between two recognized states, for example, which is not always the case, but I think that's one of them.